Scared you, didn't I? Well, depending on when this video is posted, it'll either be right before or right after Halloween. And like many people during this time of the year, I've been watching a lot of horror movies. Some good, some downright awful. So, got me to thinking. What makes horror stories work and what makes them fail? So, in today's episode, we will be discussing horrible horror.
You got the touch. You got the power. Yeah!
Hello and welcome to But I Digress. I am your host, Nathan. Call me Nate Marchand. First thing, a little bit of housekeeping I want to take care of. I realized after I posted my first video that even though I call this show But I Digress, I never once said it during that first episode. Something I intend to remedy in the future. But I digress. We're talking about horror stories today. First thing I want to say is horror stories have their place. Fear is a legitimate emotion. And one of the purposes and distinct characteristics of fiction writing is that it is to arouse the audience's emotions. If you're reading or watching a comedy, you expect to laugh. If you're reading or watching an adventure story, you expect to get excited, to get pumped. If you're reading or watching a tragedy, you can expect to cry. So, fear, as I said, is a legitimate emotion. It's part of the human experience. In fact, I have a little quotation here from Wes Craven, the famous director of such horror movie classics as A Nightmare on Elm Street, Scream, The Hills Have Eyes, stuff like that, where he says he is speaking about horror movies, but I think this applies to horror stories in general as well. He says, "What horror films do is function as an allowable insanity. They allow people to let out all the craziness and rage that we normally suppress. Horror movies take people where their minds go only during sleep states or altered states. They deal with images and situations that mirror the anxieties which shoot through us all or all of our culture. In that sense, they're very important films." So as I said, they have their place. Problem is that it seems like a lot of people don't know what they're doing when it comes to this. So I'm going to make a little confession here to you. I hate most modern horror. Now hold it right there. I see those mice racing along there to click me off, but hear me out. Hear me out. I'm just tired of the fact that it seems like any idiot with a camera and a little bit of money tries to make a horror movie, and he's a hack. He doesn't know what he's doing. If you're going to do horror stories, you got to do them right. So, with that in mind, let's begin. First and foremost, horror stories flop because they fail at basic storytelling. And one of the most prominent features of that failure is they have unlikable or forgettable characters. Let's be honest, a lot of the times, the characters that are in these sorts of stories are just there to die. They're fodder for the antagonist, whether it's a killer or a monster or whatever. They're one-dimensional, they're wooden, and you don't care. Or they're despicable. And the audience has no attachment to them. In other cases, particularly with the slasher genre, they're there to be eye candy. They're there for gratuitous nudity. Because the directors of these sorts of movies have this crazy idea that their audience is primarily interested in blood and boobs. Well, some of us like a little bit more substance, I would say, and get kind of annoyed at this sort of content, because it undermines what could actually be a legitimately good story. Another problem that characters in these sorts of stories have is they're idiots! They are idiots! In fact, a lot of times, the whole story hinges upon them being idiots, making dunderheaded decisions that people in their right minds would not do so that they could further this plot along. Now, I am not against having idiot characters or even having plots moved along by the actions of idiot characters. But when every single one of the characters is an idiot, again, I stop caring. Another problem they have, and this is true across the board with fiction, but it seems especially true in a lot of horror stories, is the characters are cliche. And you always want to avoid cliche characters in any sort of story, because they're bland, and again, nobody cares. They just look at it as like, oh, I've seen that 100 times. I don't care. So, what you need to do is, if you really want to increase the fear and suspense in these sorts of stories, you need to populate them with protagonists that people get attached to, that the audience gets attached to. They identify with them. They're connected to them. Because then they don't want to see them get killed. They especially don't want to see them get killed in horrific fashions. It really heightens the tension. Get them invested. By getting them invested, as I said, you increase the fear and you increase the suspense, which, as I said, is the goal of these sorts of stories. Now, while we're on the subject of characters, a lot of times, the antagonist in these sorts of stories is made memorable, but to the point where they overshadow all the rest of the characters, or in some cases, they're so prominent that nobody cares about, as I said, about the protagonist. They're just there to die. Let's be honest. Nobody watches Friday the 13th because it has such great heroes. No, they watch it because they want to see this guy go around and hack people to death. Your villain, I understand that the success of these stories often depends on how good the villains are. What I think needs to be done is all of the characters need to be memorable, or at least strong. So that you don't just have guys like this overshadowing everything. Another problem is they have weak plots. And a lot of times these are plots that are riddled with overused tropes. I've mentioned a few of them when talking about the characters, such as the characters acting like idiots and being stupid. Or another one is the characters being despicable, which I know sometimes is necessary. Imperfect characters seem to be a staple of these sorts of stories. But their imperfection should not make them so despicable that the audience isn't willing to root for them. Otherwise, again, they don't care, and they're just waiting for them to die. Which, as I've also mentioned, seems to be another prominent feature. Characters are just there to die. But the one that annoys me the most is the seemingly invincible villains. I'm going to tell you this right now. They're boring. They are absolutely boring. They do not create any sort of suspense. They don't even really generate that much fear. Most of the time. They just make the protagonist look powerless, and once they look powerless, you have lost suspense, you've lost the audience, and you have no story. If there isn't some sort of possibility of the heroes triumphing, then I, as an audience member, have no reason to continue reading or watching your story. Simple as that. And it doesn't do the villains any disservice by giving them some sort of weakness or making them less than invincible. In fact, it will probably heighten the tension, because then the heroes have to figure out how to utilize those weaknesses to their advantage. There are also, a lot of times with these stories, they're not so much plots or even stories. They're just setups or set pieces to watch people die, and that makes it really predictable. People start looking at their watches saying, "Oh, someone's due to die right about now." Or they see the right setup. There's no suspense. They're just sitting there going, "Okay, we'll see. I would bet you $5 someone's going to die right about now." It takes people out of the story. What you really want to do is get them sucked in, so they're not just sitting there looking at how it's put together and predicting everything. Now, another thing, and I hesitate to call this a problem, and that is not necessarily tragic endings, but unhappy endings. I go back and forth a little bit on what I think about this, because I understand with some of these sorts of stories, they're necessary. But I also know, as a reader or a moviegoer, that if I'm going to invest all this time that I am in these characters and in this story, only to see evil triumph, I'm really going to wonder if it was time well spent. Something to consider. So I would say, if you really want to buck the trend, have the heroes win. And if you're going to let the villains win in your horror story, give a legitimate reason why. And don't just do it because that's what everybody does. Because that somehow, shows how powerful or scary the situation or the antagonist is. Something to think about. Another problem that these stories have is they're poorly executed. Now, particularly with horror movies, they're very dependent upon jump scares, where something jumps out of the camera or jumps in the frame, and you didn't see it coming, so it gives the audience member a jolt. They have their place. The problem is that if you overuse them, they're no longer compelling. Your audience gets used to it, and it's not scary anymore. But my biggest gripe with horror stories is their fixation with gore. Drives me crazy. Drives a lot of people crazy. And it's why a lot of people don't enjoy these stories. It's not scary. It's just disturbing or gross. It contributes nothing to what you're doing. If you want to make gore effective, and you want it to help contribute to the suspense or to the fear that you're trying to arouse in the audience, you have to give it purpose. It can't just be there to be there. Otherwise, I don't know how else to describe it. Your story just becomes violence porn for sadistic gorehounds to get their jollies from. And I would like to hope that you want to do more with your story, your horror story, than that. A good horror story, besides avoiding all of the aforementioned problems that I've brought up, works by operating on multiple levels. By that I mean there are many kinds of fears, and people are scared of many different things. So, by adding different ones into your story, you create multiple levels, you create multiple layers, and it creates a lot of depth. A few examples I can think of. Edgar Allan Poe, read any of his stories. He does a lot with atmosphere and a lot with symbolism. If you understand the psychology of colors in fiction, you will have a heyday with any of Edgar Allan Poe's stories. He uses a lot of different kinds of colors to create mood and a brooding atmosphere. I mean, read Mask of the Red Death, and if you understand that red traditionally symbolizes pain and suffering in stories, it adds a whole new dimension to that story. I mean. Or another one is John Carpenter's The Thing, a movie from the early 80s that I just saw recently. If you're not familiar with that story, it is about a hostile alien that invades a small research station in the Antarctic. What makes the creature deadly is that it can take over and replicate any life form it comes in contact with. So first you have an element of paranoia, because once the characters realize this, they don't know where the thing is, and they don't know if any one of them could be carrying it, or could be that alien. You have an element of isolation, because they're in the Antarctic, they're cut off from any sort of help that they could get from the outside world. They're on their own. And then you have the environment itself is incredibly hostile. They can't just run out and try to escape escape the research station, escape the alien, because they'll die out in the cold. But the biggest one is that there's a huge element of distrust amongst the characters, because they constantly question what all of them say and do. Always wondering if they're the alien in disguise trying to manipulate things to accomplish its own ends. In fact, there are actually characters in this movie who haven't been infected or taken over by the alien, who end up getting killed by the other characters because they think they're being manipulated, they have been taken over. But probably my absolute favorite example, I cannot praise this movie enough, it's one of my favorites, is the original Alien, directed by Ridley Scott. I love this movie. If you want to know how to make a good horror story, watch that movie, because it works on so many levels. I mean, you have the people's fear of the dark, because the ship that they're on has a lot of dark places, a lot of shadows, and they never know if the alien is lurking in them and it can jump out and get them at the last possible second, and they would never know it. You have claustrophobia, because it's a very contained environment. It's a very small environment with little room to run or to maneuver. But what really makes it frightening is it examines what is a very taboo subject. Something that is rarely broached in a lot of stories. At least, it's not broached well. And that's rape. I mean, let's be honest. That's what it's about. It's about interspecies rape. Because you have a parasitic alien that incubates another life form to carry its young for a period of time, then it bursts forth. That is terrifying. So many levels. And just to show you that I'm not some schmuck who's blowing smoke, I'll share with you some examples of horror stories that I've written myself. The first is in my novel, Pandora's Box. Now I know it's primarily military science fiction, but it does have some horror elements in it. For one thing, there's a subplot in the book involving a virus that is used as a biological weapon during a war. Let's just say the virus is like rabies on steroids. Anyone who contracts it goes into an animalistic rage and starts attacking anyone that they see, which is the primary way that the virus is spread. There's also a chapter in here that is a dream sequence that I guess you could call fantasy horror or surrealist horror. Not quite sure. But I did have a friend who read the book and told me that that chapter reminded him a lot of Edgar Allan Poe. That should give you an idea. The second is in The Day After, a short story collection that I self-published with a couple of friends. My story in this is called Suicide Soldier, and it is a tie-in with Pandora's Box. And it's about how the aforementioned virus is spread in the United States, which was done by infecting a young woman whose immune system can fight the virus off for a while, and then sending her to the United States, and she ends up in a small town and befriends a family who's there. The end of the story shows her slowly succumbing to the virus, and how terrifying it is for her. And finally, Destroyer, a novella I self-published and co-authored with Natasha Hayden and Timothy Deal. Obviously, it's about a giant monster, and monsters are staples of horror stories. Although, I have to admit, the most horrific parts of the book were actually written by Natasha, believe it or not. And don't really involve the monster. Check it out to find out how. That's all I have for today. If you would like to hear more about the subject, I highly recommend my sister show, the podcast Derailed Trains of Thought, which is hosted by my friends Nick Hayden and Timothy Deal. They have an episode on it called Fear is a Fun Factor, and they have a lot of great things to say about the subject. Otherwise, thank you for joining me again today on But I Digress. Now, go forth, true believers, and craft your own horror stories that remind your audience why they once feared the dark. One of the most common things that a bad horror story does is it fails at basic storytelling. And one of the most common ways that it does that is it has loud tractors that interrupt my filming.